Good,
I want to thank Eileen for putting out the publicity. I want to thank Susan Winters for sourcing, Helene Herman and Sheila for hosting tonight. This is our third time with Helene Herman. We started Coffee and Conversation, and bingo, our biggest audience was the first year we had Helene. It was about Mahjong. So if you have the history of Mahjong, so if you have a really good topic and a really good speaker, of course, people will come. Last year, I think we learned about Jewish history of Spain. And this year, hot topic, Jewish gangsters. I'm going to give the program over to Sue. I just want to mention, if anyone has not read a book called Button Man by Andrew Gross, please do. It also tells the story quite well. I'll introduce you now to Sue Winter. She is our VP Programming for the Garden State region, and she'll give you some information on our speaker tonight. Susan?
Okay, thank you. I want to introduce my friend Helene Herman. I first met Helene in 2020 when we were studying the beginners Hebrew together through the Women's League Hebrew program. That was the first year they started it. This year in August, I had the privilege of seeing Helene via the internet and Zoom have her bat mitzvah. She read the Torah, the Haftorah, plus she had a beautiful Devar Torah. Helene Herman is the sisterhood president of her synagogue in Tamarack, Florida, and serves on the synagogue board as marketing co-chair. She recently retired as president of a 400+ member lifelong learning club in South Florida. Helene is a lecturer for the adult learning program at multiple universities on a variety of historical and cultural topics. She has had over 30 years of executive level experience in global marketing for a variety of American manufacturers and holds a BA in anthropology from NYU. Her background in culture anthropology was instrumental in putting her on the path to her marketing career. She does complementary programs for women leagues, affiliates, and sisterhoods. Helene, you can start now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the heads up about the bat mitzvah, which was an experience, because I did the whole thing Friday and Saturday all by myself, and went from, as Sue knows, from knowing nothing. So welcome, everybody. Nice to see a nice group here. And I am the granddaughter of a real live Jewish gangster, a wise guy, Louis Adelson. So what we're going to look at tonight is the dark side of a Jewish immigrant experience in America. The main focus of the program will be in the period from Prohibition to the end of World War II, because that was a time when Jewish gangsters with their Italian partners controlled crime in America. The Jewish gangsters mostly forgotten. Why? No one wants to remember them. They're meant to be ashamed of, and also they didn't leave a legacy of families, of crime families. So we'll talk about that throughout tonight's program. When you say gangster or organized crime, what do you think of? You may think mafia. If a Jewish gangster, you'll think Meyer Lansky, the brain behind the Braun, the mob's accountant, who was affiliated and involved with organized crime, with the mafia throughout his life. Or you may think about Bugsy Siegel because you saw the movie with Warren Beatty. But the story is more extensive, and it goes back to the 19th century. It's not just about the leaders, but the ones who work for them, a cast perhaps in the thousands. Now you get to meet some of my family. There's my great-grandfather, Shia, who I'm named after, Sam Adelson. Louis's father, a very, very religious and mostly unemployed construction worker who spent his days in shul praying for work, while his wife, Fega, who you see in the middle of that old picture, worked her fingers to the bone as the superintendent of a tenement in Brownsville, Brooklyn. It's kind of like a tree grows in Brooklyn. Now, 2 of their 5 sons, my grandfather and his kid brother, Nate, followed a life path very unlike that of their cousin, RCA founder, David Sarnoff, who was very ashamed of his cousins in my family. Louis became a member of the Brownsville Boys and worked for Louis Lepke Buckhalter as a union enforcer, a slugger. Nate spent 5 years in Sing Sing for union racketeering, something his daughter Hertha, who became a Suffolk County family court judge, said he was set up. He never did. Somebody got him in there for no reason at all, but we know the real truth. He was not a particularly good person. Now, on the other side, Louis's wife, Grandma Julia, you meet her later on, their family had their skeletons too. So growing up, I'd hear stories. I'd hear whispered stories, some overhearing adult conversations. Sometimes some of them adults would even tell me things, and I thought these were Bubba mices. I never really paid attention. And then in 1972, The Godfather came out. Grandpa took me aside. Cookie, don't make these bums into heroes. They kill people. And Grandpa started talking about his past, talking about some of his experiences. He also told me that the stories that my grandmother's Aunt Ida, his mother-in-law's oldest sister, told me were all true about the bars that were really brothels on the Lower East Side of New York. Now, don't Google Louis Adelson. You're not going to find him in any books. He was a soldier in this large army. And like soldiers, he didn't like to talk about it, but he talked enough about his experiences in the Jewish mob. He told me that there were 3 commandments of gangsterdom. You never steal from other gangsters, you never lie to other gangsters, and above all, you don't rat on other gangsters unless they did the first 2. Therefore, they deserved it. So years after his death, I came down to visit my mother right here in the apartment where I'm living in Tamarack, Florida. And I photocopied some pictures. I photocopied some pictures with no names of long dead gangsters. And I brought them down to Florida. And she recognized them not only as family friends, but pointed out one who actually lived with them for a while. We'll talk about him later. And that's when I really started getting involved in the dark side. Once Upon a Time in America, a great movie and very realistic. So historically, a very small percentage of every immigrant group turns to crime. It's a way out of poverty, something that appeals to teenage boys. Some of them became adult criminals. Some fired our imaginations, but most have been forgotten by history. This is the story of not so nice Jewish boys and men who went to shul in the morning and created mayhem after Shabbos was over. To those who may be incredulous to learn about the dominance of Jewish gangsters, we have to remember that most immigrants then and now don't start life at the finish line. So a few things stand out, and we'll hear about this as the program proceeds. Most Jewish gangsters were shul goers, at least on the high holy days. They were devoted family men, particularly good to their mothers, one of the reasons that they went to shul. They kept their activities secret from their families. Unlike the mafia, sons and families were almost never included, occasionally a brother, but never your son. Jews wanted their sons to become respectable, and gangster activity, that was just a means to an end. So they came to mostly to densely populated urban areas. Most notorious one was the Lower East Side of New York City. And these gangsters that came were mostly the children of Eastern European Jews who came from 1880 to 1917, the Great Immigration Period. By 1917, the population of Jews in America, again, primarily Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, had grown from 250,000 to 3.3 million, 9% of all immigrants. Now, these gangsters grew up in traditional homes, generally not strictly Orthodox, meaning that mama might light candles on Friday night, but then she may go to the movies. They may go to shul, but they'll go out for Chinese food. And they grew up in neighborhoods that were infused with this, what I call a folk Judaism. Most of the gangsters continued the behavioral patterns and the Jewish traditions that they learned as children into adulthood. Jewish ritual remained an indelible part of who and what they were for their whole lives. Can you please mute yourself? Thank you. Because I'll forget words like the. Okay, thank you. So the golden land that they came to was not so golden. There was a wonderful song that I actually sang at my mother's funeral because she sang it on the Yiddish radio, Grina Kazina, about a greenhorn who comes over and finds, running away from pogroms in Europe, and she finds tough times in America. So the golden land again, poverty, anti-Semitism, Plus, they had this transition from the shtetl to a tenement, a loss of structure, a disintegration of the norms and the values that were common in the society that they left behind, something called anomie. This was an environment that spawned gangsters that, for the most part, preyed on their own, on fellow gangsters. They came to an America where anti-Semitism was quite prevalent. I guess nothing changes. KKK, Henry Ford, the conspiracy from the elders of Zion, school quotas, and economic discrimination, not just from Gentiles, also assimilated and secular German Jews. So blocked from respectable avenues to success, these young Jews found different routes. Sports, particularly boxing, by the way. Entertainment, don't have to explain to you that Jews kind of invented the movie industry. Also Broadway, Simpan Alley. And then finally crime. Why crime? Easy money, the lure of quick money, and the power and the romance of a criminal lifestyle attracted the children of both Jewish and Italian immigrants. Alternatives to sweatshops, child labor, which was terrible, and hard life in the city. So they came into gangs where they found solidarity, brotherhood, loyalty, rites of passage to manhood, forbidden adult activities. So my grandfather Louis went to work at the age of 9, dropping out of 4th grade to help support a family of 7. Grandpa, the poor and powerless, found money and power in the burgeoning gangs of Brownsville, Brooklyn. But the roots of criminality actually goes back to the middle of the 19th century with the children of German Jews. Jews' spotless reputation as America's most law-abiding citizens started to tarnish along with an increase in population. But these very first criminals were the middle-class children of shopkeepers, maybe petty thieves, confidence men, rarely resorted to physical violence. Unfortunately, soon saw the evolution of violent gangs and these master criminals who always dressed like successful businessmen. And the first one was Monk Eastman. He led the first big street gang and got involved with prostitution rings, gambling rings. But the big thing he did was he started hiring out his men, particularly for politics, to deliver votes for Tammany Hall, multiple votes for Tammany Hall, which was for a long time the Democratic Party machine in New York City. So he's hiring out these guys, and it set the stage for future developments. The next guy, kind of good looking, Max Kid Twist Wyback. He was a successor. He was called Kid Twist because that's how he liked to kill people, by twisting the victim's neck. And he happened to be the lover of my great-grandmother, of Louis' mother-in-law. They met in her oldest sister's Lower East Side brothel. For everyone traveling in New York and go to Lewis and Delancey Street, that was where they met. So he actually died. He was killed in a lover's quarrel, which probably suited his lifestyle. And he was succeeded by Big Jack Zelig. Increased the use of thugs, and every thug had a nickname. My favorite name of all time was Gyp the Blood. I don't know where that came from, but I love that name. And then the guy who's dressed like a workman, that was Dopey Benny Fine. He was a member of the gang, went on to lead it, and he was the first Jewish labor racketeer, union all the way. He refused to work for the bosses, not even for large sums of money. We're talking like in 1910, $15,000. And he ended up his life as a successful garment manufacturer himself. So with World War II, 1917, coming into World War II, these early gangs started to fade. Soon they were overtaken by much more powerful gangsters, and their scope went far beyond New York. But the alliances and the experiences in these early gangs set the stage for the next chapter. Big change was coming, and prohibition changed everything. That's when the modern Jewish gangster was born and became a businessman. Actually, after prohibition, Jewish gangsters dominated the New York metropolitan area criminal underworld and went elsewhere, as we'll see as well. Throughout the United States, 50% of all major bootleggers were Jewish. Lots of money was made, so it created a need for organization and structure. The money also gave them power for large-scale corruption. And crime was a means to become a somebody, to move up and out. A legitimate work that was hard and dull, that was for suckers, offering only slow economic or social mobility, if any. Crime was exciting. Jewish gangsters, like other gangsters, saw themselves as providing a service, something sociologists call a victimless crime. If people wanted booze, if people wanted drugs, if people wanted to gamble, if people wanted illicit sex, hey, the gangsters, they just furnished them. Unfortunately, physical violence was accepted as a tool of the trade, a way to eliminate your competition and to protect your interests. And the man who really changed everything was Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein did not come out of poverty. He was the son of a very well-off, upstanding Upper West Side businessman, Abraham Rothstein, Abe the Just, who owned dry goods stores and a cotton processing plant. His son was a mathematical genius, but totally uninterested as a student. His proteges like to call him the PhD for Papa Hat Geld. Started gambling young, and that turned out to be his Achilles heel. On Saturday, on Shabbat, his father would go to shul, and he would take his father's money, gamble it. Fortunately, he won, replace the money after sundown. By 1910, he's running casinos, investing in racetracks. How did he get that money? He was the son of Abe the Just, and his father's bankers had no problem lending him money. He may or may not have fixed the 1919 World Series. He was never indicted for it. He was never indicted for anything. Also in 19, he got married to a Gentile girl, and his father sat shiva for him. No more family. He could do whatever he wanted. And with Prohibition, he saw huge business opportunities. So he diversified from gambling and brothels, etc., into bootlegging and narcotics. We'll talk about narcotics. He brought high-quality liquor from England or Canada, not bathtub gin, which could make you blind. My grandfather actually went through that. Again, holdings in speakeasies, nightclubs, racetracks, casinos, a businessman, and never wanted to be part of anything that he couldn't totally control, anything that wasn't totally classy. Very big on customer service. That made his establishments very successful. As a matter of fact, one of the people working in one of his casinos was Nicky Arnstein. That little sliver in Funny Girls, actually, it's true. He did work for a big time bootlegger. So anyway, he served as a mentor to major gangsters. He taught them how to dress. Always dress like you're a successful businessman. People say, "What do you do?" "I'm a businessman." How to act and how to negotiate, and how to take the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. Rothstein's always the brains lurking in the background, never getting his hands dirty, something else he taught to his proteges. He lent lots of money to politicians, and he didn't care if he never got it back because he got paid all right, major favors. His father ran into business problems, and even though he was estranged from him, Rothstein anonymously got his father a $300,000 bank loan. Still took care of his estranged father. His Achilles heel, gambling, did him in the end. In 1928, he ran into a streak of bad luck, could not win, and he was shot and mortally wounded at a poker game. And being a good gangster, he refused to say who did it. He was buried in a talit in an Orthodox ceremony, except for the $5,000 bronze casket. And his father had to say Kaddish for his son once again. So the business of crime expanded both in focus and in geography, beyond bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling. Narcotics, okay. It's a fallacy that Jewish gangsters were not into narcotics. Well, unfortunately, they started and controlled it. It was Rothstein. Rothstein said, "Hey, this thing isn't going to work. This prohibition is going to be repealed, and we need an ideal and very profitable substitute." So it's easy to buy drugs in Europe. Legitimate companies, particularly German pharmaceutical companies like Bayer, as in Bayer aspirin, had no problem selling large amounts of drugs to American gangsters. And I'll give you an idea of how lucrative this was. Okay, in 1923, 5 pounds of heroin bought from Bear,
Here, give
$1,000.
me your phone here.
Can you please silence? Please mute yourself. Thank you. So anyway, five pounds of heroin bought from Bear in Europe for $2,000, sold on the streets of New York for $300,000. That's a great profit margin. After repeal, what are they going to do? The narcotics trade is increasing. They were all ready for it. And the Jews were soon joined by their Italian partners. And after World War II, by the way, the Italians took over the drug trade. So in 1934, we know what's happening with Bear. They no longer have their contacts in Germany because of Hitler. So the Jews went to China. And the Jewish gangsters taught the Chinese how to make heroin. And they oversaw Chinese factories there. The other big thing was the growth of labor racketeering, which was very big in my family, unfortunately. As I told you, it was used by Prohibition gangsters, but it became really prevalent and organized during and after Prohibition. Jewish gangsters, for the most part, were pro-union, particularly during strikes. But after the strike was settled, they were infiltrated. The unions were infiltrated, and they took over. The unions were forced to take on their men, extra men, including my grandfather, who became a painter when he wasn't busy busting skulls for Lepke Belkulter. The Jewish gangsters also went into the heavily Jewish garment district, where the bosses were mostly German Jews, but not all, who looked down upon the Eastern European Jews. So some historians say that this actually started out as a class issue of uptown versus downtown Jew. And business also expanded geographically. The beginning in the heart of organized crime was the Lower East Side, but that spread into Brooklyn, then throughout the US, wherever there were good roads and water, except one toddling town, Chicago. Chicago was controlled initially by Irish gangs and then Italians with Capone. The only, notorious Chicago gangster that I was able to find is none other than Jack Ruby, who was an enforcer for Capone. And we know what Jack Ruby ended up doing. Okay. So the big six of Jewish bootlegging, the big ones: Lepke Buckholzer, Brooklyn; Dutch Schultz, Bronx; Meyer, Lansky, Lower East Side; Bugsy, Siegel, from the home of $1 million condos now in Williamsburg; King Charles Solomon in Boston; and Newark's own Longey Swillman. But these were just the bosses. There were many underlings, and typical Jewish gangsters were either immigrants or first-generation Eastern Europeans, city bred in their early 20s. And again, the parents were not Orthodox usually, and sometimes it's because they couldn't be. This was not a 5-day work week country, so many of them had to work on Saturday. They would be called working class traditional. They would observe whatever traditions they could, but they were not strictly halachic. Typically, these men did finish high school, though the high achievers did. They were always very strongly attached to their family, and usually the only criminal in their immediate family. Occasionally, you have some cases with siblings, including my own family. Now, how did the American Jewish community feel about these gangsters? They were ambivalent. They were fearful of how Jewish criminal activity would affect them, and it wasn't idle. Besides being anxious that their children would be attracted to and copy the gangster lifestyle, which, by the way, Jewish gangsters never actively recruited the children. They discouraged them, and later on ended up sending many of them on to college. But the big thing was that it would foster anti-Semitism that was growing even more so, really at its height then in the 20s and early 30s with, again, KKK, Henry Ford. Then because of radio, you had Barbara Charles Coughlin spewing hatred on the national airwaves. And then finally, the growth of the German-American Bund and the Nazis in America. The fear of anti-Semitism was widespread. You started to see a grudging admiration for these tough Jews, these don't mess with me Jews. Actually a positive image when faced with those terrible gangsters, the Nazis. So you probably have all heard about Meyer Lansky, and I can tell you I could do an hour on Lansky alone. Very interesting guy who came to Lower East Side at the age of 9, being in pogroms in a Russian-controlled area of Poland. He always said he was Polish. He hated Russia till his dying day. A victim of pogroms there, comes to Lower East Side, victim of early anti-Semitism and abject poverty. As a teenager, he met 2 people that played a big part in his life. One was an Italian boy named Charlie Luciano, Lucky Luciano. They became lifelong friends and partners in bootlegging. He also met Benjamin Siegel, Bugsy Siegel. And then they started creating a gang to hire out men for violence, and this time murder as well. Kind of what Eastman started back in the previous century. And this became a model for what became Murder Incorporated, the enforcement branch of the crime syndicates. In 1929, Lansky and Luciano were key in forming called the National Crime Syndicate in Atlantic City, a conference linking together Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs. There's a show that you could still get on HBO Max called Boardwalk Empire. If you haven't seen it, it's fabulous. I rewatched it recently. It's actually very, very realistic. And a lot of what I will tell you is covered in there and done in detail. So at this conference, they turned organized crime into a lucrative business run like a corporation with a board of directors. No more boss of bosses. And the financial mastermind behind this was Lansky, another mathematical genius. He managed the funds of the mob. He financed major programs and endeavors. He bribed authority figures, very important. His personal empire was gambling, and he himself never gambled because as a young man, right before Shabbat, his mother gave him some money. I'm not sure if it was to buy challah or to go to the communal kitchen where they would keep the trunk cooking overnight. Anyway, first crack game, he lost his mother's money. He never gambled again, but he made a lot of money off of his own gambling operations. He helped develop Murder Incorporated, as I told you, the enforcement branch of the syndicate, which we'll get into more detail later. Personally, he was a short guy, even-tempered, quiet class, meticulous dresser, and devoted to his family. His oldest son, Buddy, had cerebral palsy, and Lansky tried everything he could to try and cure him. As you know, there is no cure for that. The kid in the military uniform, that's Paul. Paul ended up going on to West Point in spite of who his father was, no help from his father, and ended up becoming an engineer and a model citizen. And there's the baby Sandy, who always spoke lovingly of her father and wrote books and made a lot of money on the lecture series. He expanded his operations from the Northeast down to Florida, New Orleans, 1937 Cuba, and Vegas in 1947. Again, very successful because he understood the true mathematical odds of gambling games. Even after the decline of Jewish gangsters after World War II, Lansky continued to be involved with the mafia in Florida, in Vegas, and in Cuba. He particularly saw, where I live right now, Southern Florida, Greater Miami-Dade, and Fort Lauderdale as lucrative centers for casino and off-track betting. He used the National Wire Service to connect all the racetracks in North America that was developed by Moe Annenberg, the father of the guy who published TV Guide. I don't know if that exists anymore, Walter Annenberg, who went on to become a big philanthropist and a diplomat. By 1948, Lansky owned 50 gambling interests down in Dade and Broward counties, and then the Kefauver Commission. Some of you may remember the name Estes Kefauver, who ran for vice president on Stevenson's ticket twice. Anyway, Kefauver came down hard on the gambling operations. Well, it was very easy. What Lansky did is he picked up his operations and went to Cuba. Worked with Batista, very corrupt and horrible man, and the mafia to control gambling in Cuba until the revolution. He had interest in lots and lots of places, clubs, and hotels. 1959, everything is there. And one day he has it all, and the next day, the revolution comes, and he's left without anything and flees back to Miami. He also started investing in Las Vegas, and we'll hear a little bit about Las Vegas when we talk about Bugsy Siegel. And he actually had an interest in the Flamingo Hotel until 1967. So if any of you go to casinos, I'm going to give you some advice directly from Meyer Lansky. Don't gamble. Not going to win. The house is going to win 83% of the time. But if you do gamble, your best bet is blackjack. I guess he didn't have to fix games, but the house wins 83% of the time. He died in Miami Beach in 1983 of lung cancer, but we'll see him a little later on when we talk about the Gangsters and Israel. Live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse. Well, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel did the first two, but he did not have a good-looking corpse. Benjamin Siegelbaum, abject poverty in Williamsburg, one of the poorest of all the gangsters. By 14, he started a gang protecting pushcart peddlers. Grandpa knew him personally. He said Benny, called him Benny. Benny was as crazy as they come. I never call him Bugsy. He was called a chaya. That's a Yiddish word meaning an animal, untamed. He was among the founding members and chief operators of Murder Incorporated, the enforcement branch of the syndicate, as a hitman and muscle man because he liked to kill people. He liked violence. And even after control of Murder Incorporated went to Lefty Buckhalter and Albert Anastasia, he continued on as a hitman. It's estimated that he murdered over 30 people alone, not including those whose murder he arranged or those he killed with other enforcers. He started out as a bootlegger, then ran gambling operations. In 1936, he either relocated or was relocated, because he definitely was a loose cannon, to Los Angeles, where he ran mob operations in gambling and drugs and finally racketeering. He worked with the syndicate to extort movie studios. He'd take over the local unions like the Screen Extras Guild or the LA Teamsters and stage strikes to force the studios to pay off the syndicate so that the unions would start working again. He wanted to be a movie star. One of his best friends was the actor George Sand, a handsome guy. Borrowed over $400,000 from celebrities because he hung out a lot in Bel Air and Beverly Hills. Never paid anybody back. It was in LA that he developed the dream of Vegas. It's just a whole long presentation. So if you don't know about it, I'd tell you to watch the movie Bugsy. If nothing else, you get to see great, great acting. So he was assassinated in 1947 at the age of 41. And there's theories about why that money was being taken to Switzerland, hidden in Switzerland, that he was overriding. But Meyer Lansky's daughter, Sandy, tells this story. It's about a grudge. It seems that Luciano, back in the late 30s, is trying to get out of going to prison for life. And the lawyer, Moses Polikoff, starts complaining because Siegel is late for the meeting because he was bringing the bagels. How could you have a meeting without bagels, right? So Polikoff is stirring up Luciano, who's notorious for, a really bad temper. And finally, Siegel finally walks in with the bagels late, like nothing happened. And Luciano lays into him, and Siegel calmly tells him to go expletive delete himself, drops an F-bomb. Now, even Lansky couldn't say Bugsy, because only one person could tell Luciano where to go, and that was Lansky himself. And as we're going to see in the next slide, he did that already. So when they met as teenagers, and at that time, Lansky was much shorter than you see in this picture, really little guy, and big, burly Luciano tries to shake him down. And Lansky looks at this big, husky Italian guy and tells him where to go, drops an F-bomb. And that was the start of a great friendship. Luciano called Meyer his blood brother. Their relationship reflects the strong alliance between Jews and Italians. Together fought off Irish gangs and realized that they were more alike than different. My running joke growing up in New York City was, how do you tell the difference between an Italian mother and a Jewish mother? The Italian mother wears a cross. Now, these young Italian gangsters were not like the old time mustache Pete's. The Italian gangsters who were brought up with anti-Semitism and tales of the blood libel and the Jews killed Gentile babies for Passover wine. Horrible stories like that. In fact, the Jews and the Italians got together to get rid of the boss of bosses, a guy named Asteria. My grandfather spoke fluent Italian, listened to opera. His Italian buddies all spoke Yiddish. When Luciano was deported to Italy, he said the thing he missed the most was corned beef and pastrami on rye. And believe me, he didn't have it with mayonnaise. A mob expert named Ralph Salerno says it was a marriage of convenience. They were in the slums at the same time. The 3 M's, moxie, chutzpah, muscle and money. The Jews put up the moxie, the Italians the muscles, and together they split the money. But I got to tell you, there was plenty of Jewish muscle in this. So this is a guy you probably don't know about. I'm going to talk to you about the rise and fall of one Irwin Wexler. It was called Waxy Gordon. He got his nickname because he was a child pickpocket and he was a sneak thief. He was so good, he put his hand in your pocket and was like it was lined with wax. You'd never feel it. That's how he started out. But he had his power taken away when he messed with the wrong people. After running in the gangs as a child, he became an enforcer for Dopey Benny, and he was an expert schlammer. That's what they did. My grandfather was a schlammer. So that's why, nothing to be proud of, but why I know about it. You took a metal pipe and you wrap it in newspapers, I guess, to dull it. Anyway, so Waxy becomes a protege of Rothstein and ends up running Rothstein's bootlegging operations. He himself gets into illegal gambling. And it was he who actually made a brilliant proposition to Rothstein. He said, instead of running Canadian booze through Detroit by roads, why don't we use speedboats? Great idea. Instead of using speedboats, they decided to use actually big ships and not just go to Canada, but also bring booze in from South America and from Europe. Waxy was a very successful bootlegger, and he carried himself like a successful businessman. He was married to the daughter of a rabbi. This was a Jew who tried to hide his roughness, called a grub ying. He emulated Rothstein's class. They actually found a receipt that he purchased silk boxers from Paris at $45 a pair. That's in the 1920s. He had 2 homes, a mansion on the New Jersey Palisades. I wonder if we could find it now, with a moat around it, and a sprawling 10-room apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, kind of like Midge Maisel. In both places, he had libraries with leather-bound books that he never read, and he always posed to his family as a businessman. So then he made some mistakes. He got into a feud with Lansky and Luciano over some stolen shipment of booze, protected initially by Rothstein, and then Rothstein dies in 1928. So what does Lansky and Luciano, what do? They didn't kill him. This is before the syndicate, before Murder Incorporated. They let the federal government get him on tax evasion. Most of the gamblers were gotten not on murder, but on tax evasion. In 1930, he paid a whopping $10.76, an unreported income of over $1.4 million. So he goes into jail. He's in jail in 1933, put there by Thomas Dewey, who we'll hear from later on. And this kind of shattered the illusion of respectability he tried to create for his family. His son, this is tragic, his son's pre-med at the University of North Carolina, finds out about his father. It's January, gets into a car, travel up from school to plead with the judge for leniency, and dies in a car accident. This guy failed to insulate his respectable family from the truth, and his marriage failed too. His wife had no problems getting a get, went to jail for 10 years. Later on, in the 50s, he got involved in heroin traffic, actually died of a heart attack and buried 5 blocks away from my house at Mount Hebron Cemetery in Flushing. So I mentioned Murder Incorporated. And most of you probably are familiar with the term. And basically that was established by and answerable to the syndicate. But these guys, they were professional assassins who took murder contracts from mob bosses throughout America. first headed by Siegel, then Lepke Buchholder and Albert Anastasia, enforced by Jewish and Italian gangs, primarily in Brooklyn, but also other places as well. The Brownsville Boys were led by Abe Rellis and a guy named Bugsy Goldstein, who was the basis for the Little Caesar character that was created by Edward G. Robinson. Again, these guys always dressed classy. Also enforced by Lepke's labor thugs now. I've been asked many times if my grandfather ever killed anybody, and I have no idea. I don't doubt it, but I don't know for sure. He took that with him to his death. So no one was murdered unless it was voted on and ordered by the syndicate. They killed their own. They didn't kill passerbys. They killed their own people, very targeted. Give an example, Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz was weakened by 2 tax evasion trials from Dewey, and he asked for permission to kill Dewey, and the syndicate refused, and Schultz disobeyed, unsuccessfully tried to kill Dewey, so in 1935, they ordered his murder. The guys hung out in a place called Midnight Rose Gold's Candy Store, which is on Saratoga and Livonia Avenue in Brooklyn, not far from the late lamented Fortunoffs. They used a lot of different weapons, and one I had a highlight up there, the ice pick. I was reading about ice picks. Okay, I had to show a picture of it. Yeah, they use guns and rope and acid and knives, but mostly ice pick right through the ear into the brain. The most prolific killer was a guy named Pittsburgh Bill Strauss, over 100 murders to his credit or discredit. He travels around the country. Again, they didn't just kill people in the area. They would go all over the country carrying out contracts. And he'd have a small leather case that had a change of clothes. You had to dress well, a pair of pants, a white shirt, silk underwear, of course, a gun, rope, and the ice pick. Now, Luciano's favorite hitman was an Orthodox Jew named Sam Red Levine, had red hair, not from New York, Toledo, Ohio. He always wore a kippah under his hat. He kept strictly kosher. He tried his best to be Shomer Shabbos, but although he never planned to murder anybody on Shabbat, if he had no choice, put on his tallit, go to shul, say his prayers, and then go out and do the job. Lepke and Gura. These are 2 gentlemen whose pictures I showed to my mother with no little police report there, no name on it. And my mom remembered Lepke as being a gentleman. She recognized him. And Jake Gura Shapiro bounced her on his knee and gave her horsey rides. So Lepke's mother called him Lepkala. That's little Lewis in Yiddish, and that was shortened to Lepke. Started out in gangs, in and out of prison, and then in 1922 starts working in union racketeering with his childhood friend, Jake Gura Shapiro. Gura was his nickname because he had a speech impediment. He'd say, "Get Gura here," instead of "get out of here." First, they're working for Rothstein, then they end up working alongside of him because they are controlling unions through force and fear. Lepke said the trick was a captive union and a captive trade association, so you get both management and labor in your pocket. You skim the dues, you extort the bosses. Luciano first liked and admired Lepke's devotion to his mother, but later on said, hey, with the rest of us, it was booze, gambling, and whores, but Lepke took the bread out of the workers' mouths. By 1935, in his racketeering business, Lepke and Gura Shapiro grossed about $1 million a year, again, thinking 1935, and had about 250 men working for them. They're controlling lots of rackets, garment industry, trucking, baking, painting, motion picture industry. That was big, something that a lot of the mobsters tried to control. The other job as a head of Murder Incorporated was to ensure that the syndicate was insulated from any connection with these contract kills. So they'd pass it one-on-one, they pass it down, maybe 2 would be involved, but nobody knew who started this contract kill. That way they couldn't implicate their employees. Lepke, it turns out, was the only major mob boss who got the death penalty on a murder conviction. He was already in jail, thanks to Dewey, for what? Tax evasion. was actually ratted on by Abe Relis in 1940 and executed in 1944. Despite the murderous brutality he exercised in his business affairs, he was a considerate son, a doting husband and father, barely drank, never gambled, proud Jew, gave lots of money to support his mother's synagogue, never missed high holiday services, and according to a dossier kept by the FBI, led a quiet home life. Relis, incorrigible thug. He looked like it. He looked like a psychopathic killer, which he was. He had powerful hands. His weapon of choice was the ice pick. He was so good at it that they thought that the victims died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And my mother, Thelma, remembered him as Uncle Abe, who lived with them for a while on Hinsdale Street in East New York, Brooklyn. Seems he was on the lam for a change. My sister-in-law, Marjorie, well, she's related to Guy at the Bottom, Bronx boy Irving Nadles Nitzberg, put on trial for murder because of Relis. Relis at first was controlling the Jewish Murder Incorporated gangs, and you had the Italian Albert Anastasia working with the Italian gangs. But again, not just New York City. You had contract killings all over America, far away from New York City. So Relis is being slippery, and he's eluding conviction, keeping his hands kind of clean in that respect. But things started to change in 1940. Things started to unravel. And he started becoming implicated in killings. And he figures, hey, if I'm convicted, I'm going to die in the chair. His pregnant wife overhears a conversation and goes nuts. Pressures him to turn rat, and he did. He turned informant. And it enabled the police to start closing the book on murders, not just in New York, but all over the country, particularly Newark. His testimony really opened up the eyes to the New York area Jewish community to the tragedy of Jewish gangsterism, which they tried to deny. Night before he was going to testify against Anastasia, he was in the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. He was under police surveillance, and they found him dead on the roof. And the only way he could have landed there is if he flew there. That's where they say the canary could sing, but he couldn't fly. But obviously it was an inside job in the prison. So this is one of my favorite anecdotes. You all remember Bonanza. I love Bonanza. Sometimes I watch it on reruns. This is the amazing but very true story of Gangy Cohen, who was tied to Bonanza. So a contract is put out on this guy named Walter Sage, a slot machine skimming on Long Island. And they picked Gangy to kill his best friend, Walter Sage, and do it up in the Catskills. So July 1937, Sage is in the front seat, Gangy sitting behind him. Sage is feeling comfortable because his best friend's not going to kill him. But meanwhile, two other gangsters are following because they're not sure he's actually going to go through with it. All of a sudden, the car swerves, goes into a ditch. They see Gangy bolt and run into the woods, and they pull up, and there is Walter Sage dead in the front seat with 32 ice pick wounds. The driver is in absolute shock. Gangy is gone. 2 years later, two gangsters are bored. They go over to the Loews Pitkin, very famous movie palace in Brooklyn, to watch William Holden in Golden Boy. And the film cuts to the ringside crowd, and there, in glorious black and white, is Gangy Cohen. They go to Midnight Roses to report, and the next afternoon, a gaggle of gangsters goes to see it firsthand. They shook their heads and said, well, if this crime thing don't pan out, we could always go to Hollywood. Well, Gangy went to Hollywood and reinvented himself as a bit part actor and extra named Jack Gordon, typically cast as a heavy. Meanwhile, back in the Catskills, Pretty Levine had turned stool pigeon, and there was a wanted poster. I don't know if you remember wanted posters that you would see in post offices. So a cop is sitting there in the movies watching it, and there is Gangy. They get Gangy extradited from Hollywood, facing indictment for murder, but he got his Hollywood ending. He was acquitted, he walked away free, and went back to Hollywood, where he continued his career as a bit actor until his death in 1976, playing thugs primarily, and had many bit parts in Bonanza, where he was a stand-in for none other than Haas, Dan Blocker. So New Jersey had Longey Swillman, the Al Capone of New Jersey, which Al Capone hated anybody being called the Al Capone of anything, any place. He said there's only one Al Capone. Another guy who was very, very poor. He quit school to support his family after his father's untimely death. He's selling produce in his neighborhood with a rented horse and wagon, not really making enough money, and he has a family to support. So you get into the numbers racket, and by 1920, he's controlling it with the help of hired muscle, thanks to Capone. Became addicted to making money. He's quoted as saying, "All I remember was that as kids, my brothers, sisters, and I, we was always hungry." During Prohibition, he started smuggling whiskey into New Jersey through Canada by ships, expanded into gambling and prostitution rings and labor racketeering, but also had legitimate clubs and restaurants. He had a famous lover, Jean Harlow, and he's the one who got her a 2-picture deal at Columbia Pictures with Harry Cohn, hopefully without a dead horse in his bed. He married well. His wife was a daughter of the president of the American Stock Exchange, and of course, according to his wife, he was just a successful businessman. Very, very close to Capone. The two of them controlled the movie projectionist union way before digital, right? No projectionists, no movies, no money. He had very strong political influence in New Jersey, having the police and the prosecutors and judges in his pocket. Despite his reputation as this ruthless mobster, he was very sensitive to being a Jew. When asked why he would go into a funeral parlor, he said, "Because I'm a Cohen." He and his wife were very well respected by their neighbors and by Newark's Jewish community for their charitable work. Always from the beginning a Zionist sympathizer, helped ship arms to Israel, gave lots of tzedakah, including $250,000 to clean up the Newark slums in the 1930s. So he moved away, as most Jewish gangsters did, busy with his restaurants and his nightclubs, but he's found hung in his home in 1959. Death ruled a suicide. But the police found bruises on his wrist. He was tied up before being hung. It was mafia connected, and his murder was actually green-lighted by none other than Lansky. When he died, over 1,000 attended his Orthodox funeral, and the services were conducted by Rabbi Prince, president of the American Jewish Congress. In 1919, Detroit was the first major U.S. city to go dry, even before Prohibition, and bootleggers got to work there, building a network for transfer booze very easily from Windsor, Ontario to Detroit. Good connection up in Windsor, Ontario with the Bronfman family. In 1920, when the Jewish population of the United States was about 2.5%, the population of Detroit, Jewish population of Detroit was 3.5%. By 1929, the smuggling, manufacturing, and distribution of booze was the second biggest business after automobiles, employing over 50,000 people. Again, Bronfman's helped that. The toughest Jewish gang in America, in fact, probably the toughest gang in America, was the Purple Gang, led by 4 brothers, which is unusual. They were very, very violent, exceptionally violent, very savage and sloppy. They were responsible for supplying quality Canadian whiskey to the Capone organization. They did join the syndicate, but their sloppiness led to their downfall. They ended up dead in jail. Only one survived, going down to work with Lansky in Miami. And 1939, the Sicilians took over. So let's go back to 1929. So 3 Purple Gang members are going to shul. It's Yom Kippur to Orthodox congregation B'nai David in Northwest Detroit. And in the back are 3 G-men. Remember the term G-men? Government agents. And they're all waiting. They're going to get these 3 gangsters, and they're disguised as Hasidics, including false payas. They're going to arrest the 3 hoodlums after service, but they walk outside during a break in services, and they light up cigarettes, and that was it. Their cover is blown, and the gangsters got away. So the death of Relis and Lepke really signaled the end of Murder Incorporated and a shift of power from Jews to Italians. Some Jews still stayed involved, but basically it moved away from New York area and definitely moved away from Jewish power. Now, an interesting story about Lepke. He was prosecuted by Thomas Dewey, who wanted to be president. But first, he became governor of New York in 1942, and he goes to visit Lepke in jail, and he offers him reprieve if he'll implicate the advisor to FDR named Sidney Hillman, who was a former president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. So Dewey's planning to run against FDR in 1944, and Lepke refuses outright and went to the chair. He said, "I'm not a rat, I'm a Democrat and a big fan of FDR. So I guess there is honor among thieves. After World War II, a few Jewish mobsters like Lansky and Mickey Cohen continued to hold significant power and organized crime. But again, things shifted to Vegas, Miami, Los Angeles, and basically the power shifted to the mafia. And the big difference, mentioned early on, unlike the mafia, the Jewish American gangsters did not create a crime family. As American Jews improved their conditions, these thugs and racketeers disappeared, merged into more assimilated crime environments, or just left. And American Jews buried the public memory of their gangster past. And many ended up becoming respectable parts of the community, becoming philanthropists, supporting in particular UJA and ADL. But even though a few did stay involved, the Jewish American criminal organizations that rivaled the Italians and the Irish mobsters have largely faded. So the paradox is they were good to their mothers, and the mothers were the greatest influence on their Jewishness. They revered their mothers. It's kind of like the Italians did the same thing. They both had songs. We had My Yiddish Mama, and they had a song about Mama. They brought their mothers homes. They cared for them. They never told their mothers what they did. They hid everything from their mothers. Lansky always talked about how his mother hated to see us go hungry, and she sacrificed herself for her children. Often the sons saw their fathers as failures, struggling to get ahead while crime was an easy way to get status. Now, these Jewish mothers, they didn't know what their sons did, but they expected something from their sons. They expected them to have a connection with the Jewish community. Whether believers or atheists, they continued Jewish traditions, as I said before, learned as kids. Meyer Lansky was an avowed atheist, yet he maintained membership in Temple Sinai down in Hollywood and gave money for its upkeep, attended service on the holidays. He gave a lot of money to Brandeis University and anything that he could do for Israel. At least during Mama's lifetime, many of these tough Jews obeyed Mama, going to services on high holy days just to please their mothers. Most of their closest friends and associates were Jews. They spoke Yiddish. They married Jewish women at least the first time in ceremonies conducted by rabbis. Again, gave a lot of tzedakah to Jewish causes, went to high holy day services. Their sons were circumcised, milot, and they had bar mitzvahs. Abe Relis, thug that he was, loved his mama. In agreement, every Friday night, he's gonna go to his mama's house to have gefilte fish, chicken soup with noodles and boiled chicken. Sounds like my grandmother. So one Friday night, he has a contract on this guy named Johnny. What's he gonna do? He invites Johnny and another guy, Bugsy Goldstein, to have dinner with Mama. And then he sends Mama out to the movies. Again, traditional but not observant. It wasn't even dish night. They murdered Johnny, disposed of the body. Actually, it was Goldstein who took him out to the Canarsie swamps and dumped his body in the swamps. And when Relis's mother came home, he sat down with her for a glass of tea and a piece of honey cake. Even nutty Bugsy Siegel and the rest of the syndicate put love of Mother over everyone else. At a syndicate trial, Bugsy defended a man who failed to get a getaway car because had to return to his dying mother. He was unanimously acquitted, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. So this is a process called compartmentalization. You're living two lives, very common. It's the ability to separate what you do to earn a living, your business life, your professional life, and your personal life. One way private, another public. My mother, until late in life, had no idea of what her father actually did. She thought Grandpa, who was a painter, right, went to work wearing a suit and carrying a case. They kept families separate, never implicated them in criminal enterprises. West Coast gang, Mickey Cohen said, we had a code of ethics like bankers and other people. You never involve your wife or your family in your work. They would protect the children, they would go to things like keeping newspapers for them by buying up whole issues. They wanted their children to marry well and achieve respectability. They wanted them to be legit. They sent their kids to the best schools, encouraged them to enter the professions like other Jewish parents. The children recalled wonderful fathers who just happened to be gangsters when they found out, not gangsters who were their fathers. Again, another major difference. Most Italians stayed on the mean streets of the neighborhoods. And as soon as Jewish gangsters made some money, Upper West Side and then the suburbs, dressed well, not flashy, they were successful businessmen. Many of the Italians stayed in the neighborhood, dressed flashy and let everyone know what they did, and passed the business of crime onto their sons, building families. Jews never recruited the younger generation. Crime was a way out of the system. It's actually a way in, a way to make money and buy your way into the American dream, not for themselves, but for their kids. So with the bad came the good, and we had our own inglorious bastards. So all over America, you're having Nazi rallies. And it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma for mainstream Jewish leaders. They had no legal grounds to stop the rallies. So two Jews, Judge Nathan Perlman and Rabbi Stephen Wise, went to Lansky to ask him to disrupt the rallies. They said, we'll pay you whatever you want, but you can't kill anybody. And Lansky said, I'm not going to take 1 cent, but I'm really sorry you won't let me kill anybody. He's quoted as saying, I was a Jew and felt for those Jews in Europe who were suffering. They were my brothers. Lansky's men spent 1 year effectively breaking up Nazi rallies, busting head skulls, breaking arms and legs. Nobody died that we know of. Lansky said we wanted to show them that Jews would not only sit back and accept insults. We were no yeshiva boys. I knew about this from a fairly young age. My grandfather proudly beat up Nazis after a huge rally at Madison Square Garden, February 20th, 1939, a pro-America rally. I hope I can watch the whole thing. It really turns my stomach, to be honest.
February 20th, 1939. Just months before Hitler invades Poland and ignites the deadliest war in history, thousands of Nazis gather for a rally at an indoor arena. But this isn't Nuremberg or Berlin. This is Madison Square Garden in New York City.
You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press.
And the man speaking isn't a member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle. He's Fritz Julius Kuhn, a U.S. citizen and head of the German-American Bund, or association.
Kuhn wanted a rally to celebrate George Washington's birthday. The first American fascist is what they called him. They signed a contract with Madison Square Garden. Said, okay, we agree. No swastikas, no anti-Semitic signs, none of that stuff. Of course, once the contracts were signed, those agreements went out the window.
This program was produced for the German-American Bund rally.
We love him for the enemies he has made. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fritz Kuhn.
Kuhn then went on to deliver a very, very predictable and very, very typical National Socialist stump speech about racism and the Jewish conspiracy and the communists and how everybody's an enemy and everybody has to be alike.
We, the German-American Bund, organized as American citizens with American ideals and determined to protect ourselves, our homes, our wives and children against the slimy conspirators and the parasite hand of Jewish communism in our schools, our universities, our very homes.
Then, an unemployed plumber tries to silence the American Fuhrer.
Isidore Greenbaum tried to rush the stage, but these guys beat him. It looked like an SS beating in the Berlin streets. His pants were ripped off. And the audience, of course, cheered at this. To see someone beaten up, had they known he was Jewish, they would have, probably even cheered louder.
You get the idea. Okay, we're getting close to the end. I know he's getting nudgy there. So when I was a little girl, I was a teenager, I had something called a Submarine Race Watchers Club, and I thought that was a big joke. But Nazi submarines actually plowed the Atlantic and plowed the coast, and they did have sabotage going on. So the Navy actually came to Lansky and said, can you go to Luciano, who was in jail at the time, and can you get the mob who controlled the docks to protect the docks from sabotage, which the two of them worked together to do that. Again, it was gone through the government. There's a book called Project Underworld that's about that, but there was a lot of sabotage going on. So after World War II, Grandpa and a lot of other fellow ex-gang members ran guns for Israel. Grandpa stored them in his bathtub and showered next door. These tough guy Jews really applauded the brave Jews fighting the War of Independence. And the connection again to the Italian gangsters I just referenced, controlling the docks, enabled smuggled guns to leave America to go to Haganah, and shipments going to Arab countries were either lost or diverted to Jewish hands. And of course, after independence, Jewish American mobsters gave lots of financial support to Israel. Many tried to go to Israel under the law of return, and many succeeded, not Lansky. He actually was going because he was very pro-Israel, but he went there to escape tax evasion charges. But he was deported back on the orders of Golda Meyer, who knew him. She grew up in America. She didn't want a gangster of his stature in Israel. Plus, the U.S. government said, you don't give us back Lansky, we're not going to sell you fighter jets. So he went back to the U.S. and he died in 1983. And Jewish gangsters on the whole were always known for all kinds of charity work, not just for Israel, but for Brandeis University or other non-Jewish charities as well. So in closing, there's my grandfather, Louis, with my grandmother, Julia, living in Miami Beach in 1953. And they come to visit us in June. As a little girl, I was 9. Louis takes me to meet his cronies at the original Wolfies down in Miami Beach, and Grandma is not happy because it was a shame to bring me to see those men. I thought they were nice and they treated me well, and what I remember most is how well they were dressed, all decked out in dark suits with snappy fedoras in the middle of Miami heat. The subjects about he was good to his mother, Robert Rockaway's seminal book on this topic. They said the subjects were not ashamed for what they did, but any shame it might bring to their families. But meanwhile, they supported relatives. They helped them get jobs, go to school. When my cousin Harvey could not get into a U.S. medical school because of quotas after World War II, it was gangster money that sent him to school in Zurich. He ended up working for the U.S. Army. Jewish gangsters made sure their kids lived normal lives, went to college, and their children did not marry the children of the gangsters, and they didn't inherit the business or crime. These gangsters knew they were not in an honorable occupation. They didn't want to pass it on to their kids. Gangsterism among Jews was a one-generation career. These were men who had, or thought they had, few options in their lives. The underlings, for the most part, were uneducated schnooks with no money. They started life not at the finish line, but at the bottom. This was a time when it was almost impossible to get anything beyond a high school education. Jews were kept out of many professions. We can judge them, but we have to remember it was once upon a time in America. Thank you all very much. Any questions?
Anybody have any questions?
Unmute yourself.
I do.
Okay.
Is this, what is your
lecture going to be on tape or a recording that we can show to our children?
It will be on the Women's League Net. That's
Thank
usually
you.
where they're posted.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.
You know, I was telling my daughter today, I said, you know, my grandfather was an alcoholic, pretty violent man, not with men, he was very nice with me, but we were very close. But this is a great legacy. I've been doing this lecture for 9 years now, and it's been very, very interesting, you know. And we have to, when we look at this, we have to remember that some of these people who come over today, again, they're not starting life at the finish line. And especially teenage boys, they get involved, not all of them, but many of them do, because they're looking for a way out. You know, back when my grandfather was a boy, he was born in 1904, people worked 6-7 days a week, and children were working in factories. It was just such a tough time for new immigrants in America. So we have to look at that and have a little rahmanis.
If my synagogue wants to have you as a speaker, how do they go about doing that?
Okay, email is HELENE dot T as in Tom, B as in boy, T as in Tom, TBTST, TBTST dot sisterhood@gmail.com. Susan has my email address. She can get it to you. I don't know why it's not letting me put it in the chat. Susan, can you get her the email address?
Yeah, or you can contact me at winter.susan@gmail.com and I can send you the email.
Windsor.Susan.
Winter like the season, WINTER.Susan@gmail.com.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I finally got the chat open.
Any more questions that anybody
Yeah, I
has?
have a quick question, Helene. I think you said it, but I might have missed it. You said you've been doing the program for 9 years. How old were you when you found out that your grandfather was a gangster?
Really found out was 1972.
Or how you found out?
No, it was 1972. I had heard stories. I heard rumors. I heard other relatives say something. So I was born in 40. So I was, it was in 1972. So I was my 20s, I guess. Yeah.
What were the circumstances that you even found out? Did your mother tell you, or?
No, it was my grandfather. My grandfather pulled me at the side after watching The Godfather. He went to see The Godfather, and everybody was making a big deal about these gangsters being, you know, kind of making them almost into heroes. And he said, Cookie, don't make these guys into heroes. They kill people. So that's when he started telling me about stuff. But I had heard stories. My aunt Ida, who was my great. So the good thing about having children young, like my family did, like people did in those days, is when I was born, 3 of my great grandmothers were alive. My last great grandmother died when I was 15 and a half, and her older sister, who ran the brothel, I was 17 and a half. So they would tell stories, and I just thought they were telling, you know, they're making up stories. I never believed them. But then 1972, Grandpa said, this is not, you know, this is real.
Did he show you pictures?
No, later on I started getting books. There's a book called The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Gangster in America by Albert Freed. It's a textbook. I started reading, you know, doing textbooks, starting doing research. A book called Tough Jews, which is talks about Larry King's father, who hung out with these guys. He was like a minor thug, like my grandfather. Tough Jews, very, very good book. But they were good. I started reading about it, and then I can't remember the conversation. I started doing lectures down here, and I was talking about my grandfather, and somebody said, "Why don't you do a lecture?" So I just started doing a lot of research, and the thing is, when I do research, and Susan knows this, some people read a book. I will spend hours and hours doing research, including books. I own real books. I get out of print books. I want to find out the real deal, you know. So I just started.
That was how you built the photographic library that you shared with us, I guess.
Right. Today, so what I'm working on, and honestly, FAU, who pays me an inordinate amount, an obscene amount of money to do these type of lectures. When I did the Shanghai Ghetto, Susan, okay, Shanghai Ghetto, okay, it was a 75-minute program. I got $1,100 from them. It's insane. I do a series called A Different Diaspora, and you've gotten one of them. I do Morocco, Spain, Cuba, Argentina. The one I'm working on for them for next semester, which I won't be able to publicize outside of them until next April. It's Iraq, India, Greece, and France. And I have to tell you, I've been working on India. I mean, it takes me forever just to find all these images, you know, and the stories, and to correlate the different textbooks that the different research sources I have. So it takes a lot of research.
Last question.
Yeah.
Finish what you're going to say.
Yeah, no.
Do your children know?
Oh, yeah. They knew my grandfather.
Did they know
my grandchildren? They knew my grandfather. My grandfather died in 1983. So they knew my grandfather. They knew Louis. They didn't know him when he was tough guy, but they knew him. And they know the story. That was a great thing. I had my children young. My mother had me young, and my grandmother had her kids young. So I had these people in our lives, and particularly, having my son always says, I wish I talked more to Louis and knew more about him. But, like we talked about Benny Siegel, who we knew personally, and who was like a wild animal, like a gorgeous movie star, gorgeous, but a wild animal. So yeah, my family is very aware of it. And I have my daughter, one of my daughter-in-law, she said, are you proud of this? I said, what I'm proud of is where we started and where we've come to.
That you know the story. That you know the story. I mean, it's not rumored, and at least you've got the facts.
I got the facts. I know that we started with nothing, and I did pretty well in my life, but I started out in East New York, Brownsville, with rats the size of alley cats. And here I am in beautiful Florida. So if there are no more questions, I put my...
One more, I'm sorry. Having watched the last scene with the bunch and seeing what's going on in our country right now, are you nervous?
Very. Oops. Very nervous. And I'm going to tell you something that people think I'm crazy. Why isn't this going on? Hold on one second. I can't get my picture on.
We see you. We see you.
Okay, good. Because I pressed the wrong button. I had a very great experience. In fact, I just talked to her this weekend. One of the women who talks about Torah Fund is named Irene Moses Calpe. And I met her on a trip to Barcelona about 2 years ago. And she said, I'm going to be ordained and you must come to my ordination. And the rabbinical theological seminary in Europe for conservative Jews is in Potsdam, Germany. Right now, today, I feel more comfortable in Germany, where if you put up a Nazi flag, they will put you in jail and throw away the key. Where they were the first people to put up the Israeli flag on the Brandenburg Arch. And on the night of Kristallnacht commemoration, they had in German on the Brandenburg Arch, never again is now. So I've been to Germany, and really, the first time I went to Germany, it was for business, and I really didn't want to go there. But I found that today's Germans are talk about a Schande. They are so ashamed of their past. They are so ashamed of what they did. And they tell it to their children. So I was in the Orangeburger Strasse synagogue, which is a conservative synagogue that my son-in-law's is Sabra family, before they fled from Berlin, where they worship. And I'm there, and I'm going on a tour of half of it's an active synagogue, and there's a museum, and there's a class there, and there's a little boy, and I'm talking to the teacher, and the teacher says, well, they teach Holocaust history in America, don't they? And I said, no, they don't. No, they don't. Depends upon the community, but for the most part, no. And we have a lot of Holocaust denial going on in America. And this is like last This is on October 2022. And a little boy wearing a cross in her class said to me, "Never again." Okay? I felt more, but in America, I don't feel comfortable here. We have police in our synagogue. Chabad has more police than anybody. I do not feel comfortable in America right now. I'm very nervous for our future. I'm being honest about it. I'm really being honest. I just don't. And I talked to Irene, Rabbi Kalpe, on Sunday on WhatsApp, and she said, "You can't believe what's going on in Europe." She said, 2 countries in Europe that seem to be still pretty either neutral or pro-Jewish. Germany is so in bed with Israel. They support them totally in a lot of ways. Business-wise, they're very connected, but also the Czech Republic. But Amsterdam, the Netherlands is going right. France, we know the problems in France, which has the largest Jewish population in Europe. England goes back and forth. Spain is coming back. So do I feel nervous? Absolutely. But I wear my star, and I'm not going to be a Jew with trembling knees. I'm going to be Meyer Lansky and fight for us. That's it.
Good for you. Good for you.
Any more questions?
One last thing. My daughter told me that Louis, this is true. My daughter called me and she said, Louis came to her and Grandpa Louis came to me in a dream. And he said, "If you have to, get a gun." Seriously. And my daughter is so pacifist and, new agey, but it's very scary. It's very, very scary. So, yeah. Okay. Any more questions out there?
Any more questions?
What is your website?
I don't have a website.
Oh, okay.
Part of the reasons that, I don't have a website. I just do this for people. If I recorded everything, then people wouldn't be, having me do it. And I'll tell you, I do it for places where I do get paid. So lots of tzedakah. I raised a lot of money for Torah Fund this year, but I also get money for it. So I don't have a website.
Helene, thank you so much for attending. It was great. I'm glad Susan made this connection with you. It's been a great 3 years working with you, and I'm sure we'll continue going forward. Just a quick plug. We do have a program on January 3rd, our next program, and it's called New Year, New Stress Relief Skills. And you will see it in Friday's newsletter. Thanks again and happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was great. Good seeing you.
Thank you.